At just 28 years old, Nathan Uzo was already a name that echoed across boardrooms in Lagos like a gavel. As the youngest CEO in the history of Uzo Manufacturing Industries, he had risen to power with a sharp mind and a sharper tongue. His stare alone made grown men shift in their seats. He didn't need to yell. His silence was often louder than most voices in the room. His empire stretched from the heart of Lekki to the industrial corners of Ogun State, and every investor knew if Nathan Uzo called, you answered. But his power didn't come without fear. In fact, it was built on it. At the office, no one dared breathe too loudly when he passed. The sound of his Italian shoes on the marble floors sent secretaries scrambling and managers rechecking files they'd already reviewed 3 times. A single raised brow from him could ruin someone's career. Allies who tried to manipulate him found themselves mysteriously blacklisted. Competitors who crossed him suddenly faced impossible audits or sabotage contracts. No one ever proved it was Nathan, but everyone knew better than to ask questions. He was the kind of man Lagos whispered about, not spoken to. His mansion in Ikoyi was a fortress of silence and glass. Servants moved like shadows, careful not to disturb him. His mother, Madame Veronica Uzo, a regal and distant woman, had raised him to dominate, not to love. Emotions are for the poor, she once told him when he cried as a child. She never taught him to say sorry, never corrected his cruelty, never hugged him without a reason. And so Nathan grew into a man who knew how to win contracts but not hearts. Career-wise, he was unstoppable. Personally, he was a disaster. He had no real friends. The few childhood ones had drifted off. Tired of his ego. Romantic relationships? All failed. Every woman he dated left broken, confused, or angry. He was possessive, rude, arrogant, and completely nonchalant. He didn't return calls. He forgot birthdays. He controlled everything and gave nothing. And yet deep down there was a gnawing emptiness he couldn't shake. Sometimes at night, lying in his king-size bed, staring at the chandelier above him, he wondered why no one stayed. He blamed them at first, called them ungrateful. But a tiny voice, one he fought hard to silence, kept whispering, "You're the problem, Nathan." But he'd never admit it. Not yet. Not until a quiet maid named Lily walked into his life and changed everything. The Uzo mansion in Ikoyi was more than just a residence. It was a fortress of fear. Beneath its marble floors and gleaming chandeliers was a workplace that felt like walking on a tightrope. The rules were unspoken, but deadly clear. One mistake and you were gone. Nathan Uzo didn't tolerate imperfection. Whether it was the driver arriving 1 minute late or the chef adding an extra pinch of salt, the result was the same: termination without explanation. So it wasn't surprising when the staff saw a new face in the kitchen that Friday evening. Nathan had fired the chef the previous day because the grilled chicken had too much pepper. The new girl was young, graceful, and moved with confidence that unnerved the others. She didn't look afraid. That alone made her different. When Nathan sat to eat that night, he wasn't expecting much. But the moment he tasted the jollof rice and chicken placed before him, he paused mid-chew. The smoky aroma, the perfectly balanced seasoning, the way the flavors danced on his tongue, it was a culinary experience he hadn't had in years. He cleaned the plate, completely. Back in his room, something strange stirred in him, a curiosity he hadn't felt in ages. He loosened his tie, picked up his phone, and made a call to his private staff coordinator. "I need her file, the new help, now." 10 minutes later, he had everything he wanted. Her name was Lily Okafor, 23, the only daughter of a widow who sold provisions at a roadside shop in Ohodu. She had recently graduated with a second-class upper in accounting from the University of Lagos and had just completed a 3-month culinary school training. She was overqualified for the job, but poverty didn't ask for qualifications. She was just trying to help her mother survive. Nathan sat in silence, holding the file in his hand, the words blurring for a moment. "What are you doing here, Lily?" he muttered, staring at her passport photograph clipped to the top of the page. She was beautiful, but it wasn't just that. There was something else, something that didn't fit into his cold, calculated world. The next morning at the office, the usual routine continued. Nathan entered, and the atmosphere instantly shifted. Conversations died. Laughter disappeared. Everyone straightened, adjusted, froze. Nobody wanted to be in his bad books. The few who had been before were no longer with the company. But today was different. Nathan couldn't focus. His mind kept drifting back to the jollof rice, to the girl with calm eyes and steady hands, to the mystery of her presence. He checked his watch repeatedly, something his PA noticed with confusion. He was distracted, impatient, restless. By 5 p.m. sharp, he was in his car, speeding through the streets of Victoria Island toward home. The scent hit him the moment he entered the house. A goosey soup and pounded yam, hot, fresh, and served neatly at the dining table with chilled water beside it. He didn't wait for formalities. He sat, picked up his cutlery, and took a bite. He froze again. It was heavenly, thick, rich, perfectly seasoned, and the pounded yam smooth and fluffy like cloud. He let out a low, involuntary chuckle. "Who in God's name is this woman?" he muttered for the second time. And for the first time in a long time, Nathan Uzo felt human again. The week started like every other, packed with meetings, deals, and deadlines. But by Tuesday, Nathan's world tilted off balance. During a high-stakes negotiation with an international investor, a minor clause was overlooked, and the deal fell apart in minutes. It was a multi-million-dollar loss, a disaster. And for the first time in years, Nathan had no one to blame but himself. He sat alone in his corner office, lights dimmed, the city skyline blurred behind glass. His hands were clenched around his phone. He scrolled through his contacts aimlessly, looking for someone, anyone to call. But the names meant nothing. Business partners, clients, ex-girlfriends he didn't even remember. Not a single person he could talk to, no one he could trust with his sadness. No one that made him feel understood or safe. Frustrated, humiliated, and heartbroken, he slammed the phone onto the desk and stood up with sudden force, nearly knocking over his coffee. The walls of his empire felt like they were caving in. All the power, the wealth, the status, none of it could buy him what he truly lacked: peace. That evening, Nathan found himself in a dimly lit lounge tucked away in Victoria Island. He sat at the farthest corner, away from the music, away from the eyes. With every glass of whiskey, the sting of failure faded, until the alcohol numbed everything. He stared blankly at the wall, muttering to himself, haunted by a truth that had always lingered. He had built a world too high for anyone to reach him. His driver, already alerted by the bar manager, arrived to find him nearly unconscious, his tie loosened, shirt stained. He helped him to the car without a word and drove him through the quiet Lagos night back to Ikoyi. When Nathan stumbled into the mansion, the lights in the hallway flickered softly. Most of the staff had retired, but Lily was still awake, mopping the floor near the staircase. She looked up and froze for a moment, then dropped the mop and rushed to him as he nearly collapsed against the wall. "Sir, are you okay?" she asked, voice laced with concern. Nathan looked at her through half-lidded eyes, then whispered, almost childlike, "I'm alone. Nobody loves me." His words struck her chest like a hammer. He was vulnerable, broken, a side of him no one else had likely seen. Without hesitation, Lily wrapped her arm around him, supporting his staggering weight up the staircase and into his bedroom. He mumbled incoherently the whole way, half apologies, half regrets. Inside, she gently removed his shoes, adjusted the pillows, and covered him with a blanket. Then, as if on instinct, she hurried to the kitchen, brewed a simple ginger and honey tea, and brought it back to his bedside. He was only half awake, but she helped him sip the warm drink. His breathing slowed. The frown on his forehead eased slightly. Lily pulled up a chair beside him and sat quietly. Her eyes remained on him as he drifted into sleep, still murmuring things about being unloved and forgotten. She watched him for a long time. The powerful, feared CEO of Uzo Manufacturing, reduced to a wounded soul needing nothing more than comfort. When she finally returned to her room that night, Lily couldn't sleep. His words kept echoing in her heart. "I'm alone. Nobody loves me." Nathan arrived at the office the next morning, feeling more clear-headed than he had any right to. It was odd. He remembered drinking until his mind had gone foggy. Yet here he was, fresh clothes, no headache, no mess. But the confusion gnawed at him. How did he get home? Who had helped him to bed? Who had taken off his shoes and tucked him in? The questions buzzed louder in his head until he picked up his tablet and pulled up the mansion's CCTV footage. And then he saw her. Lily. She had helped him into the house, steadied him as he stumbled, and spoken gently as she led him to his room. She had gone downstairs, returned with a warm drink, and sat with him until he fell asleep. Nathan sat frozen in his chair, the screen glowing back at him, his throat dry. She cared. He didn't understand why, but the way she looked at him, touched him, stayed with him. It lit a small warmth inside him that had long been frozen. But the ache hadn't left him. The loneliness still sat like a rock in his chest. So that night, once again, he found himself at the lounge. And once again, he drank. He arrived home well past midnight, barely able to stand. He stumbled through the gate, yelling her name. "Lily! Lily!" She rushed out, startled and barefoot. "Sir?" He looked at her, his eyes glassy with something far deeper than alcohol. "Take me to my room." Without a word, she guided him up the stairs again. When they reached his bed, she helped him sit down. As she turned to leave, his hand caught hers. "Stay," he whispered. She froze. "Nathan." But before she could continue, he pulled her toward him and kissed her. She gasped against his lips, her heart pounding. At first she resisted. This was wrong, so wrong, but the kiss felt like home, like something familiar and real, like something she didn't know she needed. "I need you," he whispered against her lips. She couldn't stop him. He made love to her like she was the missing part of his soul. Every stroke was deep and purposeful, as if claiming her, understanding her, memorizing her. And in that moment, Nathan didn't feel broken. He felt whole in Lily. She gave him everything. Because that night, she gave him her first, and neither of them would ever be the same again. He made love to her like he had known her forever, like he had been searching for her in every empty kiss and hollow embrace. His touch was urgent but reverent, like she was sacred. Every stroke was deliberate, deep, and consuming. And to Nathan, in that moment, she wasn't just a maid. She was the only person who had ever truly seen him. And for Lily, it was more than a physical act. It was her first time. And she gave it to the man everyone feared, because she saw the part of him no one else did. The broken, lonely boy hidden behind the ruthless CEO. And for one night, he was hers. When he finally drifted to sleep, Lily lay beside him, wide awake, staring at the ceiling with her heart pounding. Her thoughts raced, confused, conflicted, and completely overwhelmed by what had just happened. She wasn't sure if she had made a terrible mistake or if she had just connected with a soul lonelier than her own. She turned to look at Nathan, peaceful now, a softness on his face she had never seen before. The hard edges had melted in his sleep, and all that remained was a man flawed, hurting, and desperate to be loved. Carefully, she slipped out of bed, picked up her robe from the floor, and tiptoed out of the room. But she paused at the door, glancing back one last time. "I hope you remember," she whispered. Then she disappeared into the quiet hallway, her footsteps barely echoing. And though she had left his room, a part of her remained with Nathan, buried beneath the sheets, tucked into his heartbeat, entangled in the silence of a night neither of them would ever forget. Back in her room, Lily sat curled up on her bed, her hands wrapped tightly around her knees. Her heart was racing with emotions she couldn't quite name: guilt, fear, longing, confusion. She placed a hand gently over her chest as if to still the thunder beneath her skin. How did this happen? How had she crossed such an unthinkable line with a man who barely spoke more than a few words to anyone, let alone allowed anyone close? She thought about how broken he had sounded, how lonely he had looked. She didn't see the intimidating CEO in that moment. She saw a man pleading for warmth, for affection, for someone to just stay. And yet, what did it mean for her now? What did it mean for them both? Questions swirled like a storm in her mind, and sleep did not come easily. She couldn't stop replaying the night in her head, the feel of his skin, the way he looked at her like she was the only thing that mattered in that moment. In another room, Nathan stirred. He didn't remember much from the night before, but the faint scent of vanilla on his sheets made his brows furrow. Something about it was familiar, soothing. His body ached slightly, and when he opened his eyes, fragments of the night came crashing back, and with it, a single name escaped his lips in a whisper. Lily. Nathan woke up the next morning with a strange unease crawling through his chest. The night before was vivid in his memory, too vivid. As he dressed for work, his reflection in the mirror seemed like a stranger's. He looked fine, polished even, but his insides churned. What had he done? All through the drive to the office, Nathan sat still in the back seat, his mind racing. He felt sick. A tight knot sat in his stomach and refused to loosen. He had slept with his maid. His maid. What had gotten into him? Was he truly that lonely, that desperate, that broken? The shame and confusion merged into anger. By the time he stepped into the office, his face was stone cold. His commands were sharp, impatient, and frequent. His staff barely had time to process one instruction before another came flying. People were running around in panic. The air in Uzo manufacturing industries felt like it could crack at any moment. Nathan was spiraling. And the worst part? He couldn't stop thinking about the fact that she had told him, with trembling eyes and lips, that it was her first time. That realization haunted him, made his blood boil. Not at her, but at himself. He was her first, and he didn't even deserve it. Back at the mansion, Lily wasn't faring any better. Her eyes were tired, her steps slower. She had cleaned, cooked, and prepared dinner like nothing had happened. But everything had changed. She kept asking herself the same questions. Why didn't she leave? Why didn't she stop it? Why did she give in? She had let him in, into the most sacred part of herself, and now he wouldn't even look at her. That evening, Nathan returned home, his face unreadable. The aroma of freshly made vegetable soup filled the house, but he walked past the dining table without a glance. "Welcome, sir," Lily said quietly. He didn't respond. Not a word, just marched to his room and shut the door behind him. Her chest tightened. She knew what it meant. He regretted it. He regretted her. In the kitchen, whispers had started. 2 nights in a row, the new girl had come out of the master's room. Now everyone was talking. And Lily felt smaller than ever. Nathan stormed into his room, his jaw clenched tight, his fists curled at his sides. He headed straight for the bathroom and turned on the shower, twisting the handle until the water was scalding hot. Steam filled the room as he stepped under the cascading stream, hoping the heat would burn away the anger, the shame, the confusion boiling in his chest. But it didn't. No matter how long he stood there, eyes closed, hands pressed to the cold tiles, the feelings refused to go. If anything, they intensified. The guilt, the regret, and something far worse, the craving he wanted her, badly, desperately. Lily had become a drug, an obsession. Ever since she stepped foot in his house, something in him had shifted. He hated it. He hated her for it. But most of all, he hated himself for being so weak. "What has she done to me?" he muttered under his breath, slamming a fist lightly against the wall. He dried off quickly, tossed on a fresh shirt, and sat on the edge of the bed, eyes fixed on the small monitor by his nightstand. The CCTV screen showed Lily moving around the kitchen. He stared, breath uneven, unable to fight the pull. He reached for the intercom. "Lily," he said, his voice low and cold, "bring me a glass of water." A few minutes later, there was a soft knock at his door. "Come in." She entered quietly, holding the glass with both hands. "Your water, sir." "Drop it on the table," he said, not looking at her. She obeyed and turned to leave, but when she reached for the doorknob, she found him standing behind her, too close. Her breath caught in her throat. "Excuse me," she said, trying to move past him, but he reached out and pulled her back. His grip wasn't harsh, but it was firm, and before she could react, her back hit the wall and his body blocked her path. She was pinned, breathless, heart pounding. "Sir, please," she whispered, but he didn't wait for her to finish. He crushed his lips against hers. Hard, hungry, desperate. It wasn't gentle. It wasn't romantic. It was raw, unfiltered desire. He kissed her like a starving man, like he needed her to breathe. Then he stopped. His eyes burned into hers, dark with frustration and something else she couldn't place. "What the hell is so special about you?" he snapped. "Why can't I stop thinking about you?" She didn't answer. She couldn't. He stepped back sharply, jaw tightening. "Get out," he said. His voice sliced through her like a blade. Tears welled in her eyes, but she nodded and rushed out of the room without another word. Down the hallway, past the whispers, past the pitying glances of the other maids who had clearly been watching. She didn't stop until she was in her room, the door locked behind her, and the sobs broke free from her chest. She had never felt cheaper, never felt more broken. Nathan couldn't sleep that Friday night. He tossed and turned in bed, staring blankly at the ceiling as thoughts of Lily refused to leave his mind. It was infuriating, this pull he felt, this ache. He was mad at himself for wanting her so badly. How could a woman like her affect him this deeply? He was a Uzo. He didn't get emotionally attached. He didn't feel. And yet here he was, aching for someone he believed he shouldn't even care about. Caring for people made you weak. That's what his mother always said. And weakness was dangerous. The next morning he came downstairs to find the dining table set, and right in the center was a plate of steaming hot jollof rice, garnished and inviting. He didn't want to eat it, but the smell was too hard to resist. The first bite undid him. It was just as perfect as every other time. Rich, smoky, perfectly seasoned. He cleared the plate in silence. After eating, he stepped out into the garden to clear his head, pacing slowly along the flower beds. The early sun bathed the marble paths in golden light, but inside him, everything felt dark. Then, from the corner of his eye, he spotted one of his security staff leaning slightly too close to Lily, smiling and trying hard to get her attention. Something snapped. Jealousy surged through him like fire. She was his. She was his first. He didn't know if he wanted her completely, but no one else was allowed to want her. He marched straight toward her and called her name sharply. "Lily, my office, now." A few minutes later, she appeared in the hallway where he was waiting. "I saw you," he said coolly. "You're getting too comfortable. This is a place of work. Stop flirting and stay focused." Her eyes widened, stunned. She hadn't expected that. I wasn't flirting, sir. I didn't ask for an explanation," he cut in, his tone colder than ice. She lowered her eyes and nodded, her voice barely a whisper. "Understood, sir." But inside she was crumbling. She had always known he didn't like her, not even as a person, but she hadn't expected to feel hated. It hurt more than she thought it would. It had been 2 weeks since the night everything changed, and Lily had been feeling increasingly unwell. That morning her stomach churned violently, and she felt waves of nausea crashing over her as she tried to get out of bed. Her head was light, her body sore, and nothing she did could calm the irritation bubbling inside her. But despite how terrible she felt, she still put on her apron and made her way to the kitchen. Nathan had called from work requesting spicy seafood okra for dinner, and though she was dizzy and weak, she had prepared it with the utmost care, as flavorful and delicious as he always liked. That evening, Nathan returned home. After his usual hot shower, he came downstairs in silence. Lily was already setting the table. The aroma of the steaming okra soup filled the dining area. Just as she placed the last item beside his plate, her face turned pale, and she suddenly dropped the spoon she was holding. Clutching her stomach, she ran straight to the bathroom. Nathan stared after her, confused at first. But the moment the sound of retching echoed from the hallway, something clicked. Lily, too, felt it. Her hand went over her mouth as she sat on the cold bathroom floor. She was pregnant, and it was his. Nathan stormed down the hallway and banged open the bathroom door, just as she was rinsing her mouth. His face was twisted in disbelief and fury. "If you think you can trap me with a pregnancy, you're mad," he shouted. Lily's eyes widened in shock. "Better take care of that thing you're carrying before it ruins both our lives," he growled, then turned and stormed off without another word. Lily collapsed against the tiled wall, stunned. Tears streamed down her cheeks as her hands slowly moved to her belly. Everything happened so fast she barely had time to process it, and by the next morning, the news had spread. The entire staff knew. The whispers were no longer whispers. They had become stares, judgmental eyes that followed her every step. No one spoke to her. No one helped her with chores. It was as if she had been branded with shame. She couldn't breathe in that house anymore. She couldn't stay. All she wanted was to disappear. Lily packed her few belongings into a small travel bag. Her hands trembled as she folded her clothes. Her eyes stinging with tears she could no longer hold back. With a deep breath, she left the mansion that had brought her both joy and pain. She headed straight to her mother's small apartment in Ohodu. The moment her mother opened the door and saw her, pale and teary-eyed, she knew something was wrong. Lily broke down in her arms, sobbing as she recounted everything. The job, the man, the night, the pregnancy, and the shame. Her mother listened in silence, holding her tightly, as if trying to shield her from the world. She didn't speak until Lily had cried herself into a quiet, exhausted stillness. When Lily finished, her mother looked her in the eye and asked softly, "Would you want to keep the child?" "Yes," Lily whispered, her voice cracking. "I don't know what the future holds, Mama, but yes." Her mother nodded, stroking her hair with a firm but gentle hand. "Then you will, and I'll be right here with you. We'll do this together." She smiled faintly, her face strong and reassuring. "I've saved some money. After you have this child, you'll go back to school. You'll get that master's degree you always dreamed of. Your life doesn't end here, Lily. It's just beginning. You are stronger than you think." Lily nodded slowly, clinging to the warmth in her mother's words. In that moment, it felt like a new beginning. A small flicker of hope in the middle of heartbreak. Back at the mansion, Nathan sat on the edge of his bed, haunted by everything that had unfolded. He couldn't stop thinking about the way he yelled at her, the look in her eyes, the way she ran. The emptiness in the house had grown louder, heavier. Her laughter was gone. Her presence was missing. He had denied a child he knew deep down was his. Not because he doubted her, but because he was scared. Scared of the truth. Scared of loving her. Scared of what his mother would say. Scared of what his staff would whisper about the great Nathan Uzo sleeping with a maid. But she wasn't just a maid. She was the only person who made him feel seen, who made him feel alive. And she carried a part of him now, a part he had rejected in a moment of fear. Unable to bear the guilt, he grabbed his car keys and drove through the dark Lagos streets straight to his mother's house. In her sitting room, he paced like a trapped animal before finally breaking down and telling her everything. For the first time in years, he let the walls fall. He spoke of his fear, his shame, his longing. He spoke of Lily, of how she made him feel, of the child, of the night. His mother listened, calm but stern, sipping her tea as though weighing every word. When he finished, she set her cup down and looked at him firmly. "Nathan, what exactly do you want?" He looked at her, confused, his voice caught in his throat. "You've been searching for love all your life," she continued, her voice quieter now. "You've spent years building walls to keep everyone out. And now that someone has gotten through, someone who sees you, who carries your child, you want to throw it all away?" Nathan remained silent, his throat tight. "That child will love you unconditionally, Nathan," she added, a rare softness in her tone. "And I think you already love the mother, even if you're too stubborn to admit it." She stood and touched his shoulder. "Don't let fear make you lose the one good thing you've ever had. Do what's right. Be the man I raised you to be, not the man the world forced you to become." Her words pierced the layers of pain and confusion inside him. He felt exposed, vulnerable. but also hopeful. For the first time in his life, Nathan saw the truth in his mother's eyes. He was in love, and it wasn't too late to make things right. Nathan spent the next 2 weeks searching for Lily. He called in favors, sent people out to look, and even drove through parts of Lagos he hadn't visited in years. But every door he knocked on was met with silence. Every lead ended in disappointment. She didn't want to be found, and it crushed him more than he expected. Each day without her felt heavier than the last. Regret gnawed at him constantly, and sleep became a stranger. For the first time, he realized what true loss felt like. Not just the absence of a person, but the loss of a chance at real love. It took a full month before Lily finally agreed to see him. Her mother had watched him come every other evening, standing respectfully by the gate, never demanding, just hoping. Eventually, she sat Lily down and said, "My daughter, I won't tell you what to do, but I saw the pain in that man's eyes. He said he wants to love you right. Will you at least listen?" With reluctance, Lily agreed, and when she did, she met a completely different Nathan. He cried, he apologized, he begged for her forgiveness, for her trust, and for another chance to do right by her and their unborn child. "I was afraid," he said through tears, "but I'm not anymore. I choose you, Lily. I choose our child. I choose this life. Just give me one more chance." That day marked a turning point. Nathan moved Lily and her mother into a beautiful, cozy bungalow not far from his mansion. He promised her peace and he gave her a home. Every single staff member under his employment was warned in clear terms. Lily was to be respected, treated with dignity, and protected. Any gossip, disrespect, or mistreatment would be met with immediate dismissal. The mansion that once whispered rumors now radiated quiet admiration. Nathan kept his promises. He loved Lily with gentle fierceness. He was at every antenatal appointment. He catered to her cravings, even when they came at odd hours. He read baby books, painted the nursery himself, and made sure she felt like a queen. Their bond grew stronger. Nathan began to open up in ways he never had with anyone else. They laughed together. He'd often come home early just to sit beside her on the couch, his hand on her belly, feeling his daughter's tiny kicks. He spoke to her belly like Jewel could hear him, telling her stories of how much he couldn't wait to meet her, how much he loved her mother. And on a beautiful Sunday morning, with the sun shining gently through the hospital window, Lily gave birth to a gorgeous baby girl. Nathan held her in his arms, overcome with emotion, and named her Jewel. Because to him, she was a priceless gift, a new beginning. As he stood by Lily's hospital bed, watching her cradle their daughter with a radiant, tearful smile, he realized something deeply profound. He had built empires, sat atop fortune and fear, but none of it compared to this, to them, to love. It wasn't marble floors or towering gates. It was Lily. It was Jewel. And it was the family he never knew he needed. They lived not just happily, but whole, redeemed, and truly loved.